Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I was recently listening to two podcasts on Unbelievable. Bart Ehrman and Richard Bauckham go at it, and I loved it. It's great. Richard Bauckham is a great British New Testament scholar and theologian. He's recently retired and has written some great books and articles. He's just a great, solid guy. His British accent is pretty thick, so sometimes it's hard for me to decipher what he's saying. But I really find his argumentation typically very compelling. Bart Ehrman is a well-known New Testament scholar, particularly in manuscript tradition. In scholarship, he's respected, but in the popular level, he's really respected in the popular level because he is now an atheist. He was a Christian, and he writes all kinds of books trying to debunk Christian claims. And he makes a lot of money from it, I'm sure, because he's a very popular author, particularly amongst atheists. He is their go-to scholar. And when atheists talk about Bart Ehrman, they'll say he's a world-renowned. They'll say he's their top New Testament scholar in the world. That kind of, I mean, it's hugely inflated. In the field, Bart Ehrman is respected, particularly New Testament manuscript traditions and textual criticism. But as far as New Testament studies go, he's not respected as the leading scholar and one of the leading scholars in the world at all. So it depends on the perspective. I'm not being mean. I'm not saying that because he's a non-Christian now. I'm just telling you how it is. If you were to list the top 20 New Testament scholars and you, asked 100 people that, he's not going to make the list. I won't either. I'm not an all-star. My point is, when an atheist talks about Bart Ehrman, it's overwhelmingly grandiose attributes. So anyway, my view of Bart Ehrman is he's a smart guy. He seems pretty funny. I'd like to meet him sometime. I think he's articulate. I think he's a good author, writer. I think he's clear and smart guy. That's cool. So I like those things about him. I also find some things he does incredibly tendentious. That is, he's very leaning toward trying to make sure Christianity doesn't have the basis it does. I don't think he always or ever says that, but I think it's there. If I'm being as objective as I can be, it works both ways. There are many Christian authors who seem to be leaning that direction, trying to defend it. But I was listening to the debate in two parts, and I just had some quick reflections on this. First of all, look, I was reminded again of the importance of understanding that scholars are human beings, just like you and me. They're just humans, and they look at the same evidence. We look at the exact same citation, the exact same verse, the exact same chapter, the exact same everything, the exact same coin, exact same drawing on a cave wall, and come to different conclusions. When it comes to historical research, what we really are doing is what's called abductive reasoning. It's where you look at particular facts and you try your best to devise the most likely historical, probable explanation, or to use scientific terms, cause for it. What caused it? Now, this is what is done every day in a courtroom or CSI. They see bullets in the hall, bullet holes in the walls. They see blood on the ground and say, I bet she was shot. Oh, look, here's a gun with fingerprints on it by Billy. I bet Billy did it. Well, because we don't have a video camera recording the incident, or even an audio cassette, CD, MP3, anything recording it, we have no physical evidence of what occurred. We have to deduce. We have to look at these facts and work backwards. Then you go to a courtroom and you have one side, I was going to say one person, but one side, the defense, saying, if you look at all the facts, I know it looks like this, but here's the explanation I'm going to give you. Here's what I think really happened based on the exact same evidence. The prosecuting side is going to say, at the exact same evidence, we'll say, no. Here's our story for what happened. Then ideally the jury or the judge says, we find yours the most compelling. But I'm trying to encourage you, Christian, or even if you're non-Christian, but certainly if you're a Christian, sometimes we listen to people and they discuss things back and forth, and it sounds like someone must be really missing it. But they're not. They're looking at the exact same evidence, just coming to different conclusions, like in a courtroom. So that's very important to understand. It's limited evidence, and we look at the same evidence. What determines where you lead, where it goes, is somewhat determined by your worldview. Ehrman, who is an atheist, is prone to look for ways that it cannot be trusted and that Christianity is false. Certainly it works the other way. Certainly Christian scholars can be psychologically a little more leaning towards the belief that it is more trustworthy. But I don't want to spend too much energy on the psychology of it, because it can work both ways. But that doesn't mean it's equally applied to both ways. You can be a Christian and be quite objective on your ideas, willing to dismiss things you once thought were true but now are false. And I'm sure it can work with atheists as well, but Ehrman seems much more bent on trying to make sure it's false. Now, I'm going to say more about that in a second. I'll give my evidence for what I just said. So scholars do look at the same evidence, just like you and I do, or we could, and then draw conclusions based on that. Another thing that Ehrman says very often, you'll hear this in scholarship, particularly amongst atheists, they might even get this from Bart Ehrman, is he uses the expression critical scholars. Well, critical scholars, critical scholarship, critical scholars. This is used, of course, if we're being honest here, it's used to imply in a condescending way that the other person who disagrees with Bart Ehrman is not a quote-unquote critical scholar. Well, that, of course, is nonsense. You very much can be a critical scholar and believe in something different than an atheist. Typically, critical scholarship means scholarship that is not driven by ideological views. So scholarship that's not driven by the church or by whatever your religion is, the hadith or sunnah of Muhammad or whatever it is. There's no ideological organization driving the motivation, so it doesn't become propaganda. So critical scholarship is oftentimes synonymous with unchained, unfettered scholarship, free-for-all. We really, really are the free thinkers. The problem with that, of course, is even atheists have ideologies. It is certainly true that atheists are oftentimes not driven by a particular church to come to certain conclusions. That's true. But it is not true. I can tell you by experience. You just have to trust me or go get your own degrees, but trust me when I say it is not true that the vast majority of top-level scholars around the world writing commentaries and so forth are uncritical. You need to really read, first thing came to mind is the Sacra Pagina commentary series, which is Roman Catholic commentary series. Now, sometimes it's tendentious. Sometimes it's kind of trying to support a Roman Catholic doctrine. But in general, it is not. It's just not. You ought to read the commentary and realize it's not just simply rehashing what the Pope said. After Vatican II, they were very open to critical scholarship. I find this all the time. It doesn't really matter. At that level, the top level, you might have to try to find what a person's religious views are because they're not evident. You have to do some research. Okay, I'm reading this commentary by a scholar, blah, 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 Dr. So-and-so. Where does he teach? He teaches at Yale. Well, I wonder if that guy even is a Christian or a Muslim. What is he? You have to do some digging. It's not page one. I'm an evangelical Christian, or I'm a Pentecostal, or I'm a Lutheran. You have to find out what they believe. It's because it doesn't matter at that stage. Most scholarship in the world is not done by an ideological bent. They really are trying to be very good objective, with objective ideas at least, ideas about history. So when someone like a Richard Bauckham, who is the protagonist, I call him the protagonist, Bart Ehrman's antagonist, the other person debating him on this podcast, when Richard Bauckham attempts to make historical judgments, he's doing so in critical scholarship. He's not trying to make sure it looks like Jesus is real or something. You can listen to the podcast yourself to make up your own mind. But I've read enough about Richard Bauckham to know that he is a critical scholar. So when people like Bart Ehrman and atheists say, well, he's a critical scholar, of course the assumption is everybody who else disagrees with them aren't critical. They're closed-minded. They're just driven by the church. They're driven by their particular ideological views. And one I'd say is sometimes that is true. I've read commentaries that are like that. But I think this is fair to say, most scholars around the world are not driven purely by ideological views. They really want to understand what the truth is and what history really was and how we understand things. And of course, it's also assuming that only atheists, only non-Christians can be critical. Well, that's silly. They can also be just as easily driven by ideology as a Christian is. It depends on the person. So I'm trying to encourage you, don't let when people say critical scholarship, intimidate you. Just don't. Here's what you got to do. When someone says all this stuff and they've got all their 14 degrees and they're quoting Latin references left and right and blah, 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 here's the question you ask yourself. Is this convincing to me? Is this convincing to me? Does this compel me? That's it. Because guess what? You get to make up your own mind. You get to make up your own mind. I've had conversations with people where they've asked me questions or they debated me, or you might say debate, within the church. And they have no evidence, no scripture verses. They might cite one or two, and I tell them the historical situation. We go back and look at it. They read it themselves, and they're still not convinced. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, this is crazy. Like, they're clearly wrong. But, okay. I mean, okay. They don't find it convincing. Okay. Well, I can't make someone be convinced of something. That's not how life works. That's not how ideas work. They can't make me convinced either. So you don't need to be intimidated when people start throwing out the phrases, well, in critical scholarship. The third thing I was going to mention is the word probability. It's used in scholarship all the time when you talk about history. I don't care if it's about George Washington or 10 years ago or 2,000 years ago. History is always historical claims are always based on probability. And probability is always subjective. That needs to sink in. It is always subjective. Now, scholars will not talk that way. They will not talk that way. Bart Ehrman in this debate, and Bauckham a little bit too, talks about probability as if it is objective. That is nonsense. Probability is subjective. When they say something is likely or it is probable, what they really mean is it is likely or probable to me. Well, what you find probable depends on a wide range of your beliefs. It depends on your beliefs. If I said there are unicorns on the moon and you go, that sounds probable, that would depend. If you really meant it, it might mean that you have the beliefs that unicorns do exist, or you're very open to existence of creatures on the dark side of the moon, or there might be a lot of things. I might ask you the question, why do you think that's probable? And you might give me reasons. But that depends on you and what your beliefs are. Now, in scholarship, typically, in any kind of field, people start having certain views surface as mainstream consensus beliefs. So that in scholarship, when someone says that's probable, typically most scholars would find it compelling. Here's one little example. And I could give you many, many, but here's one example. In New Testament studies, when you seek to determine, now this is going to sound heretical if you're not used to hearing this, but I apologize, but it's there. It's been around for centuries. When people try to determine what the historical Jesus said and believed and thought, which is different from what the Gospels portray. Now, in the church, that doesn't make any sense because they think the Gospels are stenographic records of exactly word for word of everything he said. But in scholarship, critical and any kind of scholarship, that's not the view. The typical view among scholars is that the historical Jesus is something other than, that the Gospel writers have expanded or are nuanced in such a way. At minimum, it's because Jesus didn't go around speaking in Greek. He spoke in Aramaic, and the Gospels were written in Greek, besides a few phrases and words and sentences here and there. So one of the things that historical scholars of Jesus will do is they make up criteria to say, how do we determine if something is probable? Did Jesus probably say this? And one of the things they say is, does it show up in multiple different sources, called multiple attestation? If it shows up both in Matthew and in Mark and in Paul and in Revelation or whatever, well, it's more likely to have occurred because it shows up in multiple independent sources. Independent sources, called multiple attestation. Most scholars think that is a good criterion of historical probability, but it's probability. But again, they're human beings. Scholars are humans, and other scholars might say, nope, that's not a good criterion. But what happens in these debates with people like a Bart Ehrman is you hear it and it scares you to death. It can. Because you'll say, that's not probable. That didn't happen. That's impossible. They'll throw out words like impossible, improbable, not likely. But I'm trying to help you here. These are subjective terms. What Bart Ehrman really means is, it's not probable to me. I don't think it's likely. And then Richard Bauckham, the other person, the British scholar, will come back and say it is probable. Well, then they're just fighting back and forth. It isn't probable. It is probable. It isn't probable. It is probable. The point is, We get to decide what's probable based on the beliefs you have about things about the past, things about documents, things about literature. It's a whole house of cards, as it were, that determines whether you think something is probable. So I'm trying to encourage you here. Probability is subjective. You don't need to be intimidated if you hear people like Ehrman say, well, that's improbable, that's impossible. Well, because you get to decide what you think is probable. Now, little footnote, and I'll move on. I do think it matters that when the majority of a specialist community thinks something is probable, I perk up. When the vast majority of scientists around the globe think that the universe is about 13.7 billion years old, well, I find that pretty compelling. And I listen to the reasons, I read about the reasons, but that matters to me. Same thing in New Testament studies or Old Testament studies or whatever studies, I listen. That doesn't mean I have to, okay, whatever you think, I'll do it. No, I get to decide what I think is probable, but we don't have to drink the Kool-Aid, as it were. The fourth thing I want to say, so the first thing was talking about abductive reasoning and how we look back on the facts and figure out who did it. The second point was about critical scholars nonsense, that, well, critical scholars versus all of you other people. Third is about probability is always subjective, and that's okay. It means what's probable to me. The fourth thing is, something I noticed particularly about Bart Ehrman is, and it's hard not to mimic him. Maybe this means mean, I don't mean to be mean, but I can hear him say it. We just don't know. We just don't know. He says it over and over. We just don't know. We just don't know. Well, okay. What he means is when we don't know for certain. Usually knowledge claims are certain claims or near certain claims. For example, I know that I'm married. I'm not 100% certain of it. I could be delusional. I don't think I am. I'm 99.99% sure. So I can use the word know in that sentence and not be certain. So when Bart Ehrman says we don't know what the earliest oral traditions of Jesus were, that's true. We're not certain of that. That's exactly right. Bart Ehrman says repeatedly in his literature and debates and presentations, we don't know how many copies we are removed from the original New Testament to the copies that we possess. Here's the problem. The problem is Bart Ehrman does not stop at agnosticism. That is to say, without knowledge is what the Greek means, without knowledge, or ignorance. He doesn't stop there and say, we don't know, period. He says we don't know, and then assumes the worst case scenario. For example, Ehrman would say, we don't know how many copies are removed. It's probably copies upon copies, then copies, then copies, then copies, then copies. The fact is, we should hold up our hand and say, stop. We don't know. You do not know that. And since you don't know it, you shouldn't surmise what you think happened. Bart Ehrman does this with the manuscript copies themselves. Since there is evidence in the earliest 2nd and early 3rd century, the earlier the manuscripts, some of the family, this is technical, some of the traditions of the manuscripts demonstrate a good bit of errors, spelling errors. Some manuscripts don't demonstrate that many spelling errors. And so what Bart Ehrman says is, well, if there are that many errors early in the few centuries and the errors calm down when they give professional scribes, how much more are all the errors in the first few centuries? There must have been countless errors in the first few centuries. So for Bart, goes from ignorance to some kind of historical precedence, and then works backwards and assumes the very worst. So instead of just saying ignorant, he doesn't say ignorant, I don't know. He makes a conclusion. He does this in the debate with Bauckham. They talk a lot about the role of memory. And Ehrman goes on and on and on about the studies that demonstrate that memory, eyewitness testimony, can't be trusted all the time. That's all Ehrman says. He doesn't say, but sometimes it is good. Sometimes people do remember the past. All he talks about are the hundreds of studies he read that demonstrate that memory cannot be fully trusted. And that's period. But that's what Bart Ehrman always does. He's not both-sided. It's only the side that demonstrates it's false or can't be trusted. So when Richard Bauckham comes back and says, right, but that depends on the kind of memory. If it's firsthand experience and it's something very highly emotional and so forth, it is more likely that the person's going to memorize it and remember it well. And all Ehrman can say back is, no, all the studies demonstrate that it's not the fully trustworthy source. Well, that's nonsense to believe that memory can never be trusted. But Bart Ehrman can't say otherwise. He can't say, that's true, Bach, that's true, Richard, because sometimes it can be trusted. Sometimes it's really good. He can't admit that. So instead of saying, we just don't know, and then period and closing his mouth, he has to say, we just don't know, and we must assume the worst. That's what critical scholars do. They assume it's absolutely the worst. And that's just silly. Have you ever met a World War II veteran? I was talking to someone the other day whose father was in World War II, and you ought to hear this. He said, the detail he has, that he's always said for years and years and years, the exact same stories. He said he would see the kamikaze Japanese pilots smiling before they slammed into the ships. He could see their faces. He said, you ought to ask him these questions. He'll tell you all about it. I saw a TV documentary one time of a woman who talked about a speakeasy 90 years earlier. She was a little kid, and she remembered the exact details and smells and colors of the door and who was at the door. Now, does that mean eyewitness testimony is always reliable? No, it does not. In fact, this is well known in psychology. It's called confabulations. It's one of the chief reasons, a little footnote here, as my professor Wayne Stacy used to say, one of the chief reasons why you do not want to relive past trauma as a child all the time is because the brain can fill in the gaps and fill in the holes with confabulations. It can fill in false memories. And sometimes those false memories they're false. They're not even true. It causes more trauma. So you have to tread lightly when you go back on previous trauma for that reason, because you don't want to make up false memories and have all the trauma surface and they think it's much worse than it really is. So, but my point is, this is what Ehrman does. We don't know leads to, and it's the worst possible thing. We don't know how many manuscripts there were in between. Therefore, there must have been copies and copies and copies and copies and billions of mistakes. We don't know how memory works. Therefore, none of it can be trusted. Well, that's not logical at all. If we're being consistent, he should say we don't know and then stop. Another thing, 2 more points and I'm done. Another thing that he says that I notice a lot in these discussions, a lot with Bart Ehrman and other scholars, Bart Ehrman in particular, he loves the word historical. We can't say something is historical. This comes up a lot when it comes to discussion of the resurrection. Not just atheists, but Christian scholars will do the same thing. They don't want to discuss the resurrection when they do studies of the historical Jesus because they think it's not quote-unquote historical. Now, depends on the person, the author, and the scholar, depending on how they define this term, historical. But typically what it means is historical equals, quote, what a materialist or naturalist would believe is a cause. What a materialist or a naturalist would believe is a cause. What they typically do not mean by historical is, quote, whatever occurs in history. Whatever occurs in history. That is to say, most people, particularly atheists, when they say, well, that's not historical or I can't make a claim about history there, what they mean is, I can't give a cause by something else that occurs within nature as we understand it. What they typically do not mean is historical is anything that just happens in history. And that's a big deal because that will determine what you deem as historical. And so you can dismiss the resurrection as just a mythic fairy tale faith issue because I'm a true critical historian. All I'm is an historian, and I can write all that off because why? Because the cause cannot be God because that's outside the bounds of history because God is not inside of space-time continuum. He's not material. Therefore, I can't say those words, God raised him from the dead. If that's your definition of historical, then you're being consistent. My point is, I see no reason to define historical that way. Seems to me historical just means of history. So did it happen or not? That's it. So when you hear that term, perk up and listen very carefully to how they're using the term. This last thing, and this little critique of Ehrman that I find, he's consistently doing this. When Richard Bauckham, or any other scholar, makes a deduction based on the past, Ehrman says, where's the evidence? That is to say, for example, if Richard Bauckham says, if we look at the earliest church tradition by, say, Irenaeus, that says the Gospels have Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's the earliest time it explicitly says that. But before that, the Gospels seem to be quoted. Ehrman says, where's the evidence that they had names early on? Where's the evidence? What Ehrman then says is, where's the evidence? Leads to, of course, it did not have a name. It's back to that worst case scenario stuff. When Ehrman makes a deduction, it's perfectly acceptable in the worst case scenario. So if there is no evidence that the Gospels themselves had the names according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to John, on the manuscript tradition before Irenaeus. There's no evidence that they had those names beforehand. That either means Irenaeus made it up, which is what Bart Ehrman argues, that he made it up, or it just means it just wasn't written down yet. But what Ehrman says, not that it just wasn't written down yet, instead, they did not have names. They were anonymous documents that traveled around the Roman Empire until Irenaeus gave the names. Do you hear what he's doing? Because we're ignorant, that is, we don't have evidence that they had names, it therefore means they did not have names. That's false. That is not a logical inference. That is not a logical inference. You cannot say, we don't have evidence for something, therefore it did not exist or was not that way. That's nonsense. I can just as easily say, they all had names as soon as they wrote them and run at the top. My name is John Mark, I wrote this. It's just that we don't have the manuscripts that support that. And Bart Ehrman would look at me and say, David, where's the evidence that happened? I'm going to say, I don't have it. And I'm going to say, and you don't have evidence that they didn't have the names. We were in the dark. It's just that they finally were written down and recorded as far as we know by Irenaeus. Well, okay. But that's something Ehrman does all the time. If we don't have evidence, what he does is makes a deduction based on the worst case scenario. When someone else makes a deduction in the opposite direction, like a Richard Bauckham, and says, it's likely they did have names, even though we don't know about it until Irenaeus. It's likely they did have names, one, because they seem to be quoted, the Gospels in the first few centuries. Secondly, how would they have determined which Gospel they were reading from? To which Ehrman says, where's your evidence? See, they're both working backwards. Richard Bauckham says it's more likely, more probable to me, they had names early on. Then Bart Ehrman says, no, it's more likely to me they did not have them early on because they don't show up until Irenaeus. They're both using abductive reasoning. They're looking at the exact same evidence and coming to different conclusions. Where Bart Ehrman assumes the worst, instead of just being agnostic, Richard Bauckham uses the evidence and says a little more positive. So it seems to me it's more likely this direction. Well, I hope that's not too confusing. My quick reflections on the discussion. I did this really to help encourage you. When you talk to people, if they're well steeped, particularly in Bart Ehrman, or any kind of atheistic scholars like that, these terms like critical or probable or historical, I hope these things are easier to manage for you now. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com. If you look at the top, you'll see various tabs that have sermons I've preached, a link to all the podcasts I've done so far, a link to my consulting website. For more information about my consulting, see davidpendergrassconsulting.com. Also, you'll see information about the books I've written that are found on amazon.com. So davidpendergrass.com, one-stop shop, all that you need. If you want to reach out to me, follow me on Twitter, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, and send me a message. I'll see you online. I gotta run and tell about what the Lord has done for me.